Hi everyone, nice to see you. My name's Amit Katwala. I am a journalist and author formerly of Wired, and I am delighted to be joined by Rose Wang, who is the COO of Bluesky. So, Rose, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what Bluesky is, because I think people have a sense of what it is, as something similar to Twitter, but it's actually a bit more than that.
Thank you, Amit. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. A lot of people ask me, well, what is Bluesky? And most people know it as a microblogging app. But it's so much more than that. Bluesky, the app we built, is actually a demonstration of the technology that we built under the hood. Because what is wrong with social today? Today, social media is controlled by a few corporations. They control what information is in front of you and what gets taken away. In short, they control speech all over the world. And we've seen the consequences of this. And so in order to disrupt this dynamic, we actually had to change fundamentally underneath these dynamics. What does that look like? One, people need to be able to own their identity. Two, people need to own their own space. And three, they need to be able to determine what information is out there and what information they want to take away for their own communities, rather than relying on a few billionaires to make that decision. And so how did we do that? Well, we created a protocol, a new technology that enables all these pieces to come together. And so what's happened today on Bluesky is, yes, we have 44 million users after just 2 years of being publicly open. But we also have 6,000 other projects that people have built on top of this open social graph of 44 million people, of who follows who, what do they like. And they can completely rebuild the experiences. So one of the examples of this is there were 2 developers in Washington in the United States who rebuilt TikTok. How did they do that? Well, if you think about TikTok, it's vertical scrolled videos, right? But if you're building a TikTok and you have no videos because no users are using your product, you have this cold start problem. This is a huge problem for app builders today. But on Bluesky, if you're building on top of this protocol, the app protocol that we built, you can take the videos of these 44 million users and use that to build your TikTok app. And that's exactly what they did. When they launched Skylight, it went to top of the charts on the app stores, 1 or 2, because they already had all the video content from Bluesky users. So what we believe is that the world we're going to build together with all the creators, all the developers, all the community organizers, that these experiences are interoperable, talk to each other, open and public, will be so much more interesting and enriched than the singular worlds that X or Meta or TikTok can build alone.
You mentioned that the platform only launched 2 years ago. We've already got 44 million users. What would you ascribe that growth to? What's been the driving force of that growth? And what are some of the kind of challenges or hurdles that has created for a small, because I guess you wouldn't have expected necessarily to reach this point so quickly.
Absolutely. I remember when we first wrote down 10,000 users on the board, and we're like, how are we going to get 10,000 users? And so it's been quite a crazy journey for us to be able to get to about 44 million users in about 2 years. The reason why this growth happened is because we saw what current social media structures are like, when one person controls the entire platform. When you have a new owner that comes in, they can change the culture and the rules of that platform overnight and make it inhospitable to many people. And so what happened with Bluesky is the growth came from, yes, people call it lefties, but you have to look deep into, well, who are these lefties? Well, they are scientists, they're academics, they're journalists, people who want to rely on actual verified data and information. They fled because none of that was really available anymore on other social media platforms. And they came to Bluesky. Because on Bluesky, the vision is, how do we give power back to people so that they can go and figure out what rules they need for their own feed, that they can build their own feed, that if we didn't like a piece of content, we can't take it away because they own that space. That is the dynamic that we're changing. And so what we learned over this time is there are more people who are frustrated with the current way of things online than ever before. Because what does that online world look like? Well, it's kind of like medieval society, where you have land that's owned by a few noblemen and kings, and we are the tenants who work on this land. We have relationships, our identity, our reputation, all of that is based off of a platform that's owned by somebody else. And as soon as they decide, I don't like what you're doing, I don't really believe in what you believe, they can take that land away. They can take away your identity. And so what we've seen is that there's a hunger in the world from people to know what's actually true, what's actually human, what's actually created by creators and not other AI agents. That is the world that people want. And there's nowhere you can get that except on Bluesky, because on Bluesky, the world is controlled by you, not by corporations.
How much of this, because there have been other attempts to do this in the past, like with Mastodon and things like that, how much of this is about timing? Like you guys happened to launch at a time when your biggest competitor decided to like inexplicably set his product on fire and become actively hostile to users, right? Like if this had launched 2 years prior or even 2 years later, would it have had the same impact?
Yeah, I think any founder or any person who tells you that they were the god that created the company without any sort of luck is lying.
Yeah.
I think ultimately, so much of what Bluesky is we are actually here as a solution to the first wave of social. In the 2000s, when the founders created Facebook and Twitter, their goal wasn't, let me make a bunch of money, it was, let's connect the world. But then they discovered advertising, which is a very lucrative business model. And in this business model, the business model is how do I capture attention? It's not about how do I connect people. And when you're trying to capture attention, what ends up happening is you build a product that manufactures attention, which then leads to addiction. Your dopamine receptors are saying more, 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 but it doesn't feel good and you can't stop. And so what I think is really important today is that we give people something else, something that's better. And what that looks like is on Bluesky, there's lots of feeds. And one of my favorite examples is the science community. They fled to Bluesky, as I mentioned before, because there were so many unverified posts, I'm sure we've seen over COVID, right, of information out there, and we didn't know what was true and not true. And what these scientists have done is they created their own science feed. It's their own community that have their own curators and moderators. And these are geologists, zoologists, oceanographers, biologists who go through and verify every piece of information that's on that feed. That's super cool. That is controlled by the community, and we don't touch it. That's up to them. And so I think ultimately what people are looking for is a new way to do social. And we needed to go through the first wave of social where we realized all the problems that drive to exploitative information, rage bait, to ask for something new. And that's why we've arrived at Bluesky today.
What is Bluesky's business model, and like how do you make sure that you don't basically go on the same journey as Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and every other social media network? Cory Doctorow's called this like inshitification, right? This process that platforms go through, whereby they start you offering something for free and then they start extracting value from the users and so on. Like what in Bluesky's structure stops you from becoming the next iteration of that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this is actually the business model is what caused all the problems with the first wave of social, right? It's dollars per eyeballs. It's the attention economy. And there are so many problems with this because one, you don't even know if these eyeballs are humans or bots. And then two, most of the money that buys these eyeballs, they go to the platforms, not to the people who are actually creating the content, the value that keeps people on the platforms. So there's so many things wrong with that model. And what we're here to do is completely disrupt it. In fact, it's kind of in our charter to make sure that we don't go back to the advertising model. And then if we did, people could just leave. That's the whole point. And so on Bluesky, essentially what we hope to do is actually reverse the value equation. How do we give most of the dollars from users and advertisers to the creators, community organizers, builders, who are building the experiences that people want? So right now, we haven't looked at how to extract money from the network because we're an early startup. We're 2 years old, and we want people to figure out where they actually find value. But what is cool about Bluesky is, as I mentioned before, we're not just an app. We have 6,000 other projects that other developers have built. We have a developer ecosystem that is not controlled by us, and they're doing all sorts of interesting experiments on how to monetize their projects. And what we've seen is that people are monetizing their feeds. So for example, when there's an NBA game, the NBA will just throw up a feed that's ephemeral, it lasts for that day, and you can just follow everything that's happening around that conversation in that feed. And the person who creates that feed has that direct relationship with the NBA, the advertiser, and that money flows directly one-to-one. And so we've seen a lot of those experiments where the feed builders are actually making money themselves from users, from advertisers. We've also seen sponsored posts on other feeds that brands are paying users or creators to go create. And so what I hope to see is actually all sorts of interesting proliferation of experiments where we can rebuild monetization where it's not focused on capturing eyeballs, but rather following where actually value is. And there's so many examples of this. Automatic WordPress is a company that is open, is not extractive, and they've been able to make $10 billion. And they only take 10% of it. The rest of the 90% goes back to all the developers and all the other ecosystem providers. And so that's the vision that we see is the way the world is online is very feudal. We got to make it much more democratic. And what we need to do then is basically give people individual rights and attribution of their posts so they can track where that money goes so that they can earn that money themselves.
Isn't advertising always going to be inherently about eyeballs, though? Like in the sense that, like, how can you, regardless of how you bring in advertising and how different you try to make it, like ultimately it's always going to be about how many people saw the advert, how many people clicked on the advert, like, and when you start, like you can have people kind of users to users doing sponsored posts, but as soon as you try and insert Bluesky into that equation and take a cut, then the platform itself has an incentive to promote certain things to users over other things. So how do you make sure that that doesn't happen?
Yeah, the way I think about advertising is not that advertising inherently is bad, it's that the way that advertising works on social media is bad because it's the only business model, basically. And when it's the only business model, because it's so much more lucrative, it basically drives incentives for the creators of that platform to only manufacture attention, which is rage bait and extreme information, right? So that's the problem. And what I believe is that advertising is a business model that we hope other people try out and developers try out. And there's also different types of advertising. The type of advertising on social media platforms is one that's centralized and controlled by, just them. But there's advertising on the open web that's much more open and intent-based, and I think much more aligned with user incentives. So there's other ways to do advertising. But there's so many other business models. There's affiliate links. That's a huge business model for Amazon. I think a couple $1 billion, right? There are other e-commerce, huge business model for TikTok. There's so many other things that can happen, but basically, these platforms just killed all these business models because they're like, oh, they're just not as big as advertising, so we're going to ignore them. And if you only have one business model that incentivizes towards the wrong things, you're going to get the wrong experience.
So I guess a kind of higher level question then is like, how do you compete? Because you've got these platforms that have spent 20 years and billions of dollars honing how to keep people on their platform, how to maximize engagement. How do you compete with that if you're not doing those things?
That's a great question. It's a challenge for us because for Bluesky, our goal is not to think about how do we rebuild or build the next Facebook or Twitter, because the world is changing. And we're building social media at a time when people are even wondering if it's worth building social media at all. And at the end of the day, I think social media and speech are synonymous with each other at this point, right? Most young people are getting their news on TikTok. So how do we retrofit and figure out, okay, how does this world now look in this new dynamic, new paradigm? And I think that our challenge is our biggest opportunity. Facebook and Twitter, they're huge, and they have tons of users. So for them to turn the ship is really difficult. Also, they're basically AI companies at this point. Yeah. Bluesky believes something different. While all these other companies are moving towards media and just capturing attention, there's no relationship between the content creator and the person viewing the content. We think there's so much left behind with social. There needs to be communities, fandoms, small group experiences that pair with all the viewing experiences that people have. And many of these platforms have just left that behind. And so we think that there's an opportunity around community spaces where people can own their own space, own their own rules, and make money off of their own land. And so that's a direction we're very excited to explore. And you've seen that, as I mentioned, with the science community. And there's many more. We have a European project called Eurosky, where you can host all of your data in Europe, where it follows GDPR and all the laws within Europe. And you can migrate your account here, but have still the same Bluesky experience. There's just so much that's different that's happening under the hood. And eventually, as I go back to my first answer, which is, I think that our belief is we're not going to beat Twitter or Facebook as our small team of 43, or 43-person team, but rather we're going to do it with all of the creators, builders, community organizers who are building all sorts of different apps, all sorts of different games, all sorts of experiences on top of this open social graph that we've created, and that they all talk to each other. They're interoperable. And this pluralistic society is going to be so much more interesting than these singular worlds that are sterile and corporate-driven by TikTok, X, and Meta.
I think one of the key differences, or at least the way this manifests itself when you log into Twitter, what you're seeing really is what Twitter wants you to see, whereas I think when you log into Bluesky, you're seeing, at the moment at least, a feed of people that you've decided to follow. You're also bringing in some new tools, some new AI tools that will help people sort of curate their own experience, as it were. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to AI, right? AI is in every conversation. And I think it's really important because in some ways, people have compared it to electricity, right? It's the thing that powers everything else. And I think it's really important for us to talk about AI in a more nuanced way rather than this general bucket of artificial intelligence. And right now, people are using AI to create content, and then they're also using it to build apps. So I think it's really important for me to say that Bluesky, the company, we actually very much believe that AI is not that interesting in terms of being used to create content, but we think it's really interesting in terms of leveling the playing field for builders. Because in the past, builders were just people who were technical. But now, AI has made it that anybody who has an idea and wants to build it can do that. You are a builder now. And what's really exciting about AI and Bluesky's, I would say, developer ecosystem and the technology we built, it's called the atmosphere, is that these two work very well together. Because we want anyone to be able to create whatever comes to their mind. So the first demo we created on our tool called Attie, ATTIE.ai, is you can use natural language to create a feed. So you don't have to use the feeds that X gives you or that we give you. If you want to create a feed that's like, show me everything that's happening with Arsenal, that feed can get created immediately, and you can just follow along. Or if you want something even more complicated, you're a journalist, you want something like, hey, I want to find out all the information or posts that I might repost. Because you're so busy, right? You don't want to go curate that. The AI will have to go learn your taste and then go and figure out, okay, of all the posts that are in the network, which ones will Amit like, and then go and repost that. So that's our first beta. But then what we do believe will happen is that in the future, there's going to be lots of other experiences that people build with AI. But they have the same problem, as I mentioned before, as any app developer. Okay, you make an app, but you have to get users, and you have to get data. How are you going to do that? That's super hard. And if you build an app with Attie, what's really cool is you're building it for the 44 million people already in the network, and we can actually show your app to all these people. So you have distribution immediately. And then you also have data. Like that TikTok example I gave you. They didn't start with 0 videos. They started with the videos that 44 million people already created. And so what we think is very interesting for builders in this day and age is the atmosphere. What we have created is an open social graph and all this public data. Now marry it with the power of what you can build with AI. It's a match made in heaven.
It sounds great. It also sounds expensive. So I guess and that's again another potential revenue stream. Like we've seen platforms like Twitter and others lock down access to their API because they realize they can kind of charge for it if they want to. How do you, as Bluesky grows, your moderation costs are going to go up, your content hosting costs are going to go up. Like how do you balance that, and how do you even begin to moderate a 43 million person social network with 43 people?
Yep. Well, costs are for sure a big question,
Yeah.
and they're extremely expensive in AI, or for AI in terms of GPUs. But actually, when we're talking about cost, technology is changing. It's liquefying in a way that we've never seen before. And it also means that there's different ways that we can use this AI technology for cheap that I think is actually suited for some of the problems of social. Rather than generating content, I think AI is actually really good at moderation. How do you take a ton of data and actually have one viewpoint that makes these decisions so that it's essentially consistent in that decision making? And then you definitely want to have humans in the loop that then review all the decisions. But I think costs in a lot of ways do go down. But then in the future, what we hope is that, again, we're not trying to be a big company. We're trying to be a big movement and ecosystem. And so Bluesky, the app, right now, with 44 million people, is operated by 40 people. We're already showing a new way of doing things that's cheaper. Then you can go and hopefully there'll be all these other apps that are much smaller teams. And it's this entire ecosystem where the cost per project is much smaller, but because all these projects talk to each other, it's just so much more interesting. And so we think that in general, our cost structure is just going to be so much lower than these centralized companies.
How much license can you give these sub-domains or sub-apps or kind of splinter platforms to do what they want to do and set their own rules, right? Because presumably there are kind of rules that you guys have to follow, and that actually you may not want. We've seen this with Reddit, right? It's a great example of Reddit has all these little communities of people, and actually for ages they let them do whatever they want. And actually at some point Reddit, about 2 years before they were going to IPO, realized that hang on, we need to actually stop people from posting this sort of content on Reddit and really clamp down. Are you going to have to go through a similar transition at some point, or how do you moderate a group of communities where the norms might be really different in one bit to another bit?
Yep. In social media platforms today, I think of moderation as basically court systems, right? They're adjudicating what person or content can be on the platform. And the way they currently work is there's one court system on every platform with one set of rules governing an entire global audience, and they have 10,000 clerks who go make those decisions. I think that's a very broken model. And so the way that we built our moderation system is much more complex. It's much more like a court system. So think about it like a concentric circle. On the very outside of the concentric circle of this world, we have a very loose governing system. We just govern against anything that's illegal. That's like terrorism, child safety. We do that work for the entire network. But anything outside of what's legal is allowed because we lean on the side of free speech. So you can build all sorts of apps you want, but if that app has very different laws and rules to our app, then we can decide not to trade with each other. And so it's like two different states that don't talk to each other, and people and information cannot move between them. And so that could be Bluesky, the app, could have an app that, for example, maybe I don't know, gives a bunch of movie spoilers, and we're against that. And so we say, no, you cannot come to Bluesky. And those posts from the movie spoiler app will never show up in the Bluesky app. But then within Bluesky, think about that as any sort of app that you own. You can have your own rules on that app. We have our own rules, and they're very similar to old Twitter. We hired their old trust and safety team. But then within Bluesky, you can have basically like towns or cities. You have to still follow our state rules of Bluesky, but within the cities, you can have even more stringent rules that we don't govern against. So it could be like, I'm afraid of spiders. Someone can go and create like a spider label, and you can hide all posts that show spiders, for example. And so we have all these different layers of governance, and then all the problems are adjudicated at that local court layer. And then we deal with anything that's at the Supreme Court level. So it's like if a labeler is wrong, then we'll go and deal with that provider to figure out what's the problem.
What happens if there are structural differences, like a Bluesky kind of subgroup decides that it wants to use encrypted DMs, for instance, but you don't want to do that? Like, how do you navigate that potential challenge?
I think that the flexibility of Bluesky and the ecosystem that we created, the atmosphere, is, I think, the beauty and the complexity of it. So the example you just gave, which was E2E DMs, encrypted DMs, that's not something that our company has built. There's actually a different company called Germ that built encrypted DMs. What we did is we actually just integrated with them. So if you want to use E2E DMs, you'll actually see that you can install Germ onto your Bluesky account, and you can just use that service. Yeah. So that's the integration. But if it's something you don't want, for example, I think that's your question, right? It's a service that, let's say, goes against our terms of service. Then what we'll do is, if it's on the Bluesky app, we can just shut it down or not give them any access, or they can go and create their own app, but it's just not indexed or searched by any of these services that we created.
Yeah. So last question, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. Where do you think this is all going? What will social media look like in 5 years? I guess there's two options, what you hope and then what will actually happen, and how close they'll be will be interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think that because of this closed nature of social, we think of social media right now as a destination. I come here to be social, which is not at all how humans are. Social is a layer upon which we do everything. And so that's actually what we're doing at Bluesky, is we're providing a social layer, a socially intelligent layer to the web. Because what you can now do is, right, for example, dating is not a social experience. An algorithm's randomly matching you with someone. But if you layer on friends of friends on top of a dating app, that's super interesting. In fact, that was how Hinge started. Or if you layer on friends of friends or what people like on top of a music listening app, that could be really interesting, because then it's like, oh, I can match with people across the world who are listening to the same thing I'm listening to and still chat about it while I'm listening to that experience. Super different. And so I think what we're enabling is actually, we're hoping that the online web is much more social in the future than what it is today. Because right now, social is 3 companies, but social should just be like AI. It should be a part of everything.
How do you get there?
We have 45 seconds. There's 2 things we're doing. So the first hypothesis I mentioned is we do think that building towards communities and social while everyone else is moving towards media is a huge direction that we should be taking. And so that's where you have your own rules, your own space, and your own way of making money. And the second one is essentially the freedom of builders. If you remember the Twitter developer ecosystem or the Facebook developer ecosystem, that was thriving. Zynga, TweetDeck, those were such awesome experiences. And then they got shut off because those companies wanted to compete. Well, what if that can't be shut off because it's infrastructurally open? That's what we've created. And so we'll see what the world creates.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Rose Wang from Bluesky. Yep. Thank you, guys.